When I think about the cross, I think about the Gospel of Mark, because the Gospel of Mark has a very developed idea of the cross and tells us a lot about why the cross is important in understanding Jesus and why it was important for Jesus. Sometimes we think of the Gospels as just stories about Jesus, and we can pick and choose things from different Gospels. But each of the Gospel writers shaped the story in specific ways. They're almost like portraits. Like we might think that two portraits painted of the same person, maybe a president or something like that, would be different because the artist is shaping that portrait in ways that are important to the artist. And that's true of the Gospels as well. Another thing that I think is very important for understanding Jesus in the Gospels, that can help us be better readers of the Bible, is to remember that the Gospels were written about people who were real people, lived in real places with real culture. And this is a little piece of pottery that is about 2,000 years old. It comes from the time of Jesus or thereabouts. I keep it on my desk just to constantly remember that these were real people. And when I think about the Gospel of Mark and the fact that there were real people and who had fears, they had struggles, they had dreams and hopes, one of the most significant things going on in the time for those people was the fact that they were oppressed by Rome. Rome was a very harsh ruler of its provinces. It laid down heavy taxes. A lot of people lived in poverty. And if you put yourself back in that time period, you can imagine what that must have been like. They would have hoped and dreamed that someday they would be set free from this. And in fact, they did look forward to a time when God would send a deliverer, and they would be free of this oppression of Rome. So Mark just throws us right into the middle of that world. He doesn't start with Jesus as a baby, but Jesus as a grown man. And we see right off the bat that Jesus is extremely powerful. He can heal people. He can cast out demons. He can multiply food in this miraculous way. And he can even calm a storm. And so we see right off Mark showing us that Jesus has the kind of power that you would expect from a deliverer who could overturn the Romans and restore Jewish rule, self-rule. And yet then Mark does this very interesting thing in the center of the gospel where he's been building up our expectations of Jesus' power as readers. And then right in the center of the gospel in chapters 8 through 10, he starts to shift that and turn it. And not only for us as readers, but also for the disciples, because the disciples have been following Jesus. They've been going around with him. They've been seeing this power that Jesus has. And finally in chapter 8, Jesus says, "Who do you think that I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Messiah." And he's right. He says the right answer. The Messiah is the anointed one. The word goes back to a time in Israel's history when kings were crowned, so to speak, by pouring oil on their heads, which sounds strange to us today, but that's where the word Messiah comes from. And it was the word used for this expected deliverer of God's people. And so Peter gets it right. He says, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus then starts speaking about his death. And this starts a kind of pattern in Mark where he speaks about his death 3 times. And then we'll see how the disciples respond to that. And so he says, "I'm going to be rejected, I'm going to be killed, and in 3 days I'll rise again." And how does Peter respond to this? Well, we don't know because Mark doesn't give us Peter's exact words, but he says that Peter rebuked Jesus. Very strong words. So if I had to guess, I would think that Peter was thinking something like, "Oh, Jesus, don't be so pessimistic. You're not going to die. This is going to be successful. We are going to overthrow the Romans. This is going to work out." He had this power Messiah in mind, and Jesus' death didn't align with that at all. But Jesus says back to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Very strong criticism of Peter, of course. And Jesus goes on to say, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the sake of the gospel will save it. So they go on about their business, and at the end of chapter 9, the same thing happens again. Jesus says in a little bit more detail, I'm going to be rejected and killed and rise again. And this time the disciples argue among themselves, and they argue about who is going to be the greatest. And so you can really see there how they're not understanding what Jesus is about. They're not understanding that Jesus is taking not a path of power, but a path of service. And they think he's bringing this powerful kingdom, and they're going to be a part of it. And they want to know what place they'll hold in that. And so Jesus responds back to them again, and he says, no, this is about service. This is about serving others, and that's what I want from you. So we go on a little bit longer in Mark. At the end of chapter 10, the same thing happens. He tells them again, I'm going to be killed and rise again. And this time, James and John, two of the disciples, come to him and they say, we want to know if we can be on your left and your right when you come into your glory. And again, you see, they're concerned about power. And in fact, when the other disciples find out that they asked this, they get upset. So it looks like all the disciples are concerned, are more interested in power than in hearing what Jesus is trying to say to them. And then he says something that really defines the kind of Messiah that he plans to be. And this is in Mark 10:45. Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. What is a ransom? When someone is kidnapped or something like that, we pay a ransom to set that person free. A ransom sets people free. So what Jesus is saying is that his choosing this path of service and love, which inevitably will lead to the cross, will actually set people free. It's not what we expect as human beings, but it is the path of God's power. And the disciples, though, don't seem to get it. There's an interesting story that sort of starts off this whole section. So it's right before Jesus asks them, who do you think that I am? And Jesus, it's a healing story, and Jesus heals a blind man. And he heals him, and then the blind man can see, but he says something like, I can see people, but they look like trees walking around. So he can only partially see. It's not entirely clear. And then Jesus does something else to him, and then he can see fully. So it's a strange story because it happens in 2 stages, which is unusual for any of the other stories in the Gospels. But I think it's reasonable to imagine that Mark is using the story in a metaphorical way. He's just like this man sees partially and then fully. So the disciples understand that Jesus is the Messiah. They get that and they have it right, but they're having a very, very hard time understanding that he's a different kind of Messiah than they expected. But before we're too hard on the disciples, I think we should remember that this is hard to understand because this is hard for us as human beings. We desire power. We want power. Whether it's that we want to be successful, or we want wealth, or we want people to like us, we want to be popular, we want to be beautiful, whatever form power takes for us, it's very enticing. It's something that we desire, and Jesus is calling his disciples to a different way, a different path, and this path is the one that will really truly set people free. So I don't know, I mean, how many times in history have people tried to set themselves free from oppression? They've used violent revolution to set themselves free from oppression, and then turned around and became as oppressive as the people that they rebelled against. Human power is unreliable at best and oppressive at worst. And yet the power that Jesus has is not human power, it's the power of God. The power of God, we find out in the Gospel of Mark, is this surprising power that gives itself up, that is Okay, this is a surprising power that is a power that gives itself up for others, and in that way acts as a ransom that sets people free. And it's a path that that Jesus not only walks, but then calls his followers to walk. And so that's a challenging call 2,000 years ago, but it remains a challenging call to us today. It's extremely relevant today to think that we treat our enemies with love and not violence. That we serve, even if that means that we face challenges or hardships or struggles because of that. It's a challenging call for us today.
This is one of my favorite places on campus. It's called the Heroes Garden. It's dedicated to the victims, but especially to the heroes of the attack of 9/11. I come up here often, sometimes at the end of a long walk, sometimes just to get away and reflect and actually get refocused. As a teacher, as a mentor of students at Seaver College in the religion division, I come up here because I'm reminded that true heroes smell like smoke. You see, I'm aware that in our society, not only people my age, but younger people are fascinated these days by celebrities, television celebrities, sports celebrities, even criminals become celebrities. They get their 15 minutes of fame. And I see so many people emulating the lives of these so-called heroes. And I'm thinking, no, those people really aren't heroes. True heroes, like those people who died trying to save others on 9/11, smell like smoke. That is, they sacrificed themselves for others. Clearly, this is what we see in the cross. From the cross, Jesus isn't trying to save himself. He's tempted to save himself, but he didn't come to save himself. He came to save you and I. When you read the New Testament, you see examples of people who caught that vision for heroism, who also smell like smoke. People like Peter, the other apostles, and Paul. And I can identify with some of those people, some easier than others. But some of them just seemed so supernatural to me. The one that I especially identify with, and I try to help my students in class to identify with, is a young man by the name of Timothy. You might remember him. He became Paul's companion after Paul and Barnabas broke up. Probably one of the most heartbreaking breakups, maybe except for Peter and Paul of the Beatles. But they break up, and Paul has to find a new traveling companion. And the Bible tells us that he makes his way to Lystra. And he's on his way to Lystra because he has a letter that he has received from the elders and the apostles in Jerusalem, telling all of the Gentile believers that they don't have to become circumcised and follow the Jewish laws in order to be truly Christian, truly saved. That's good news for the early church, which was growing more and more Gentile. And he makes his way to Lystra, and we're told that when he gets to Lystra, he's looking for a young protege. And he hears about a young man named Timothy. And we're told that Timothy's mother was Jewish, but his father was a Greek. And Paul comes and he opens the scroll and he shares the good news with everyone in Lystra. Hey, Gentiles, you don't need to be circumcised in order to be true Christians and followers of Jesus. And then he says, hey, is there anybody that you could recommend who's an upcoming, just dedicated young Christian? Everybody talks to him about a young man named Timothy. In fact, he has a great reputation in multiple towns. And Paul decides to take Timothy. But before he takes Timothy with him, he says, Timothy, before we go on this journey to share this good news with all these Gentile churches that they don't have to be circumcised, I need to circumcise you. I'm sure Timothy thought, wait, what are you talking about? And Paul says, well, everyone knows your father's a Greek, and they may not listen to our message, even though it's good news for them, because you might be a stumbling block. I need you, Timothy, to make this unnecessary sacrifice. And Timothy, maybe that's where Nike gets their logo from, said, just do it. Timothy's circumcised. And then he helps Paul carry that scroll from town to town, telling people they do not have to be circumcised in order to follow the Lord. What an amazing example of sacrifice. also of teamwork. Not surprisingly, later on, near the end of the Apostle Paul's life, he's writing a letter to the Philippian church. He's in prison because real heroes smell like smoke. He's in prison for preaching the gospel, and he's writing to the church in Philippi, and he wants to encourage them to be faithful, even under persecution. And he says that he's sending Timothy to them. He says, I'm going to send Timothy to you. And listen to what he says about Timothy. This is after a lifetime of ministry with so many people. I have no one else like him, that is Timothy, who will show genuine concern for your welfare. For everyone looks out for their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. He's talking about other servants of Christ, that they're often torn in terms of their loyalties. And Paul says, when you look at Timothy, you see someone who's wholeheartedly committed to Christ and his church. He says, but you know Timothy, verse 22, has proved himself because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. And I hope, therefore, to send him as soon as I see how things are going with me. He knows that sending Timothy, this true hero, will encourage that church. We look forward every year to receiving new students, especially students who sense a calling from God, to be his servants, like Paul, like Timothy, in a multicultural, multi-ethnic world, where the church more and more is marginalized in our society, where even ministers fall prey to the cult of celebrity. We don't need more celebrities in our churches. We don't need more celebrities in our pulpits. We need more people like Timothy. People who are willing to make necessary and even unnecessary sacrifices for the sake of the local church and for the mission of God in our world. Our world that's becoming more and more multicultural and multi-ethnic. We need people like Timothy. We need people like Timothy who will work alongside someone like Paul, older, more mature, maybe who has a perspective that maybe you can't identify with, but who you can trust to lead you to become that man, that woman that is going to lead a generation of churches to truly embrace the way of the cross. And how are they going to do that? Certainly by preaching the way of the cross, but by seeing leaders who smell like smoke.